for the winter period, and we don't actually prepare ourselves.
Absolutely.
We might have some people from Argentina watching us.
Oh, really?
I don't know. I mean, I've emailed it out.
Okay.
So, how do you say hello in Spanish? Hola.
No, you shouldn't say that. What you should say in an evening.
What? Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just waiting for them to give me some light. I can't see what I'm supposed to say to you. Are you going to give me some light? Pardon?
Maybe you should come over here.
Oh, thank you. Okay. All right. Are you ready, Google? Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dawn Barkhuizen. I'm the leader page editor of the Daily Dispatch, and I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. And I'd like to welcome any online viewers that we have. I believe we may have some Argentinians watching us, and if you are, buenas noches. My first lesson in Spanish. I'd like to ask you in the audience just to switch your cell phones off, please. And if you want to tweet in a question as opposed to ask a question, it's #DDLeon. Before I introduce the gentleman on the stage, I'd like to mention somebody special in the audience, and that's our new editor of the Daily Dispatch. His name is Bongani Sikoko, and I don't know where he's sitting. He's not up here at the front. Bongani, are you in here? Could you stand up, please? Everybody, that's Bongani. Okay, and I'd also like to welcome you here. Thank you, Bongani. I'd also like to welcome you here on behalf of Dr. Mvoyo Tom. He's the VC of Fort Hare University, and they are our partners in the Dialogues. Now to the three men on the stage. I'm going to abandon protocol. I quite like doing that when diplomats or ex-diplomats are involved. And I'm going to start with the MC. And the MC here on my right is Mangaliso Machabani. He's not a stranger to the stage. He's done dialogues with us before. And he's the senior pastor of a very successful large church in Bishu, the Bishu Community Church. And he's a man who's very much concerned with the affairs of the nation. Second, right on the end is Herman Mashaba. And thank you very much for coming, Herman. We're delighted to have you here tonight. He's chairperson or chairman of the Free Market Foundation, and he's a man who embodies the entrepreneurial spirit that we really need in this country. He's got quite an interesting CV. I'm going to just give you a little brief part of it. He started life as a salesman working on a commission basis, operating out of the boot of his car. And he created and developed the company Black Like Me. And he started it in 1985, long before BEE ever became a concept. Today he runs his own company. It's called Lefatsi Investments, and it's got investments in a lot of different sectors, including real estate, security, and fuel distribution. He's also an author. He has his own book, Black Like You, And he also has a string of awards. I'm not going to list them all, but lifetime achievements for his entrepreneurship. And finally, Tony Leon, who doesn't really need any introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. He was the former leader of the DEA, and more recently, the ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And he was appointed by President Jacob Zuma. And there's something I'd like to say about Tony while I've got the microphone in my hand. And he doesn't know I'm going to say it, but I'm going to do it. And it's got to do with his legacy. And it was said in the last few months that Tony didn't really have a role in the struggle. And I think roles in the struggle are all relative. And they have to do with perceptions. And I've got a slightly different perception of Tony, and I'd like to share it with you. And it goes back to how I first met Tony. And I met him in the early 1980s, or the late 1980s. Not through a political party, but I met him because he joined me and the photographer I worked with, Ken Oosterbroek. And we went driving around the streets of Katlehong on the East Rand. And for those of you who were in the townships in this country at that time, you'll know that the townships were at war, or they were a war zone. They were burning. There were barricades across the road. The army was in there. The police was in there. Bullets were flying. Petrol bombs were flying. Tear gas was flying. People were dying. And what made the East Rand, Katlehong was on the East Rand near Johannesburg, what made the East Rand particularly dangerous was that Inkatha was at war with the ANC. And so you never really knew what was coming at you or who was coming at you. And for journalists, the only protection we had was the vehicle that we were in. And as we crawled around the streets of Katlehong with Tony, we hit an enormous pothole, and when I say enormous, I mean it was the size of a koi pond. If you think potholes are bad in East London, you should see them in Katlehong. And the axle of the vehicle we were in, it either broke or bent, or did something that axles don't normally do. I don't actually know what an axle is, but this one left us perched on the pothole like that, and we really sat stuck in the middle of a war zone. And we had to wait for another vehicle to come and get us. And when it arrived, we jumped out of the one we were in, and we ran down the road, and we got into the other one and drove off. And anything could have happened in that period that we were there. It just takes one bullet. It just took one bullet to kill Ken Oosterbroek, the photographer I worked with, and my friend. And he died not in Katlehong, but nearby in Tukosa. And he didn't die the day that we were with Tony. He died another day. But it was a day just like the one that we were with Tony. But the difference between Ken and me and Tony was that Ken and I were there because we were journalists, and it was our job. It was a crazy job, but that's we were paid to do the job. And of course we cared about the country, but we were professionals. Tony, on the other hand, didn't have to be there at all. In fact, in all my years as a journalist covering unrest areas, no other white politician ever came with me into such a hellishly hot zone, except Tony Leon. And he came, he chose to come because he cared about what was happening to the people in Katlehong. So we can talk about roles in the struggle and who was in and who was out. But to my mind, Tony Leon put his life on the line that day. He's a brave man, and Tony, I'll always respect you for that. Another reason why I respect Tony Leon is what he did as ambassador in this country. He served the country, not any political party, and he did not cost us any money when he did that. And Tony is Jewish, by the way. Proof that Jews do add value. And he did that by managing to turn the embassy in Argentina around from being a cost center to a profit center. And that has to do with shifting the balance of trade. And he's going to tell you about that. I'm not going to steal his thunder. He's going to tell us more about his exploits in Argentina and the prospects of South-South relationships, which I think are really exciting as opposed to South-North or South Chinese. I think it's a good, healthy way to look at the world. So I'm going to hand over to Tony now. And just remember, if you want to tweet, it's hashtag #DDLeon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dawn, for that extremely generous and warm introduction on what I believe is the coldest night of the year in East London. So I should thank you particularly for braving the elements to share this platform with Herman and me and the Daily Dispatch and Fort Hare, in respect to which, obviously, I'd also like to add my congratulations to Bongani Sekakoko on his recent appointment as editor, to again be acquainted with the excellent Vice-Chancellor of Fort Hare, Dr. Tom, who is soon to preside over the centenary of that extraordinarily remarkable educational institution in the Eastern Cape, and of course to share this platform with Herman Mashaba. I've got to tell you, Dawn mentioned BEE. I first met Herman when I was an article clerk. I don't know if he remembers it, Edward Nathan and Friedland, when he was one of our clients and he'd started a little company called Black Like Me, and our firm was his attorney. And I always think of Herman and the extraordinary success that he achieved, not because any advantage was conferred on, but in the teeth of the most extraordinary disadvantage in the mid-1980s when we met. And I say Herman at that stage suffered from black economic disempowerment, and yet he became one of the most empowered economic citizens our country has known. And Herman and I are ideologically coupled on the tote, since we both believe in the virtues of free markets. Let me also say that since I've returned from Argentina toward the end of last year, that my successor, whom I had a very warm meeting with a few weeks ago, is of course Zenani Mandela Dlamini, who is the oldest daughter of Winnie and Nelson Mandela. And of course we think about her tonight because of the illness and hospitalization of her father, who is of course also the father of our democracy, and of the many gifts of my long political life now over. It was to actually be in the light of the Mandela presidency at the very moment that I assumed the Democratic Party leadership back in 1994. So of course we think about the family tonight, and of course on the subject of politics and political leadership, in the audience tonight is my very good friend, the Eastern Cape leader of the Democratic Alliance, Athol Trollip, and his wife Angie. It's great to see you here as well. Now, I could go down a whole laundry list of people to welcome and thank, and then I would say, in the best diplomatic tradition, all protocols observed. But as you know, we've recently suspended our Chief of State Protocol. He was gupted in that wedding that you read about in Sun City. So we can't talk about protocol tonight because we don't have one at the moment in charge of it. But there it is. Now, I'm very grateful because of this book, and incidentally, Dawn has very considerately said they're going to lock the doors until every copy is sold outside, so you better make sure, if you want to get home, that you go and buy it, and that's my commercial. I'm very grateful both to the Dispatch, Pan Macmillan, for this opportunity to share some thoughts about not just the book I've just written, The Accidental Ambassador, but my recent experiences, because the other day I was in Sandton in Johannesburg, and I was going to a meeting, and the security guard had a list of names on his slate, and he said, you know, who are you? And I said, I'm Tony Leon. He looked at me, looked at his list. He said, Tony Leon, I thought you were dead. So I said, no. Well, as you can see, on the contrary, here I am, another book on the contrary, incidentally. And he said, well, I don't see you on television anymore, so I assumed you'd passed away. I couldn't explain to him in the short time I had at the Boom Gate that I'd spent the last 3+ years serving South Africa on the invitation of President Zuma. What I can tell you, although I recount on the last page of this book, my final meeting with President Zuma in November, that when I came back, I didn't say in the book what I said to him. He asked me about my time abroad, and I said, Mr. President, I know why you sent me to Argentina. So he said, why? So I said, because it is more corrupt and worse governed than we are. Now, I've got to tell you, President Zuma laughed very heartily, but he didn't offer me another appointment. Well, you can go figure, as they say. But actually, that statement, which was said as a joke, also happens to be true. And I am perhaps living proof of that adage that if you want to appreciate your own country, go and live in another. And Argentina offers us no end of lessons about governance, misgovernance, economic growth and decline. So much so that in the 1930s, Argentina was the 7th wealthiest country in the world. Today it has an economy smaller than South Africa's. Why that is so is not just the subject of this book, but also some of the lessons that we can learn from that and from the other countries that neighbor Argentina. And at the risk of boring you, when I was concluding this book, I thought, well, I've got to offer some home thoughts from abroad. So let me just share you a few of these paragraphs. South America offers no end of lessons on how to address our central failure. And I was referring to our central failure, that which was given voice by Julius Malema last year, who amazing thing about my ambassadorship, I went there, he was the kingmaker of the ANC. I came back, he'd had his head removed politically, and now today he had his farm auctioned off to pay his income tax bill, so just passed off, as they say. But the point that I made was that whatever you think about Malema, he had given voice to a rising and justifiable discontent among many, perhaps 50% of our youth, who've never enjoyed a formal job and have little prospect of obtaining one. For all the things South Africa had got right in the past 2 decades, the failure of both our system and our leaders to address meaningfully this burning issue remains the greatest danger for the country going forward. And so I wrote that South America offers no end of lessons on how to address the central failure. Copying Argentina through raiding the public purse to buy off discontented voters and fuel inflation and scare off investors was one path. But at the time of my departure from Buenos Aires, it was leading to a cul-de-sac of ever more desperate short-term measures that crippled its future prospects. The other and smarter course was the tougher road hewed by neighboring Chile and Brazil and further away Colombia, which by then, end of last year, was on the verge of overtaking Argentina as the 2nd largest economy in South America. And let me just add about Colombia that 10 years ago, Colombia was a narco state. It was a country at war with itself, with a guerrilla army trying to take over the country and gangs of drug lords who basically controlled its economy. And that country has now transformed itself through strong leadership, wise policies, and orthodox economics, so that it, alongside Panama, have now signed a free trade agreement with the United States, and it is now surging economically. This requires the creation of a virtuous cycle of addressing unemployment through boosting and building the platform for sustainable growth and incentivizing responsible behavior in exchange for subsidies. For example, the Bolsa Familia plan in Brazil makes child support grants obtainable only on proof of school attendance and of vaccinations. And of course, this necessitated subjugating short-term considerations for long-term payoffs. So what I'm saying in that although it's all done in Spanish and Portuguese in South America, there are no end of lessons which are necessary adaptation that you can make to your own country. Now, having said that, and Herman and I were talking about a book that he's recently acquired, a big volume called Why Nations Fail. One of the central lessons, we had a colonial experience here in the Eastern Cape, in the absolute border area. You have still the legacy of colonial usurpations. But the interesting thing in the 17th century was that South America and North America were both colonized. South America was colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and North America was colonized by the British. And yet at the time of the colonization in the 17th century, all the riches, all the gold, all the silver, all the wealth of the world was in South America, and North America consisted, as someone said when they arrived in the Carolinas, of a boneyard of bleached trees. And yet 400 years later, no one would say that South America was more successful than North America. So what was that difference? And in the book by Neil Ferguson, the strong inference with strong evidence is that in North America, the founding settlement was property rights coupled with representative government, whereas in South America, all the Spanish wanted to do was to extract all the gold, all the silver, put it on ships, take it back to the mother country, and provide nothing in the way of durable institutions which could be built on in the centuries going forward. And the crashing failure of South America and Latin America, which includes Central America and Mexico, for so many years was the failure to achieve democratic government coupled with strong economic institutions. Now, I had the great virtue, of course, of being the South African ambassador when those terms of trade had turned around. So that in 1980, there were only 3 functioning democracies in Latin America. Today, practically every country is more or less democratic, with a few exceptions, such as Cuba, which is more in the Caribbean than in Latin America. But the interesting thing is that it wasn't just democratic change that came, but it was coupled with some very, very strong economic reforms, very much in line with the sort of policies which Herman advocates from his platform as chairman of the Free Market Foundation in South Africa. And I don't want to dwell on that because we've got an expert who can tell you about the principles that you apply to build successful countries. But I want to give you perhaps some observations, the good, the bad, the funny, some of the sad ones, of what happens when you try and do business in those environments. Well, lesson number 1, when I arrived there, and I mentioned in the chapter in the book, how to become an ambassador with 3.5 weeks training, was that I didn't actually know what ambassadors had to do, other than to hold a knife and fork properly and, converse in agreeable terms of conversation, which is very limiting because it had to be done in Spanish, and there's a whole chapter here about mi guerra de idioma español, my battle with the Spanish language, which was epic. But the one thing that I established when I arrived at my embassy, well, I established 3 things without knowing what to do. Number 1, I would not have a party political conversation with any of my South African colleagues. They all knew who I was, and President Zuma had sent me out with a very strong instruction just before I left, when he said to me, it is very important that the face of South Africa in the world does not just consist of ANC faces, which I happen to agree with. So they all knew I was not the ANC. I mean, you have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to know that I did not come from that corner of the South African politics. And so, but my colleagues, a lot of whom came actually from the Eastern Cape, some of my diplomatic colleagues, I never asked them who they voted for, and we didn't ever discuss that. But we spent in the most intimate and in the most sometimes challenging and always the most agreeable cooperative relations, socially, economically, and politically between us, pushing South Africa and trying to sell the country. And so I hope that at least my 3+ years abroad in the service of the state proves that you can do that no matter what your political identity is at home. Because frankly, we were all animated by the same ideal, and that was to advance the interests of our country in South America, or the corner of it that we were in charge of. But the second thing, when I looked at our budget, was I realized actually that an embassy, to quote Dawn's useful phrase, is basically a cost center more than a profit center. And it cost for a medium-sized South African embassy such as ours, you, the grateful and unsuspecting taxpayer, about 15 million rand a year to fund. And we've got 120 in the world, you can do the maths. That's a lot of rands, and we incidentally, it's going to get worse because we do all our costing abroad in dollars. So go and look at the latest exchange rate and you can work out how much that's going to have to increase by. We do a lot on the expenditure side, and I turned around to my staff, I said, this embassy has got to actually do much more on the income producing side. And how do you do that? Well, there are really three multipliers that you can do. The one is to identify how South Africa can get into very, very difficult or challenging or easy markets. And those were, we had all three in the three countries I was in. The very difficult one of Argentina, the relatively easy but small one of Uruguay, and the untapped one in Paraguay. And then to see what we could do, not just to get South African product in there, but to get South American investment into South Africa. And the terms of trade went up by 80% when I was there, and that is incidentally what the economists call a correlation, not a causation. It didn't happen because of my, wondrous service. It happened while I was there, but we certainly helped direct quite a lot of those investment flows, and to look at the areas where usefully we could bring South Africa into South America. The second area, which is actually the easiest, because despite protectionism, despite barriers, it actually is the most mobile form of bringing income into a country like ours, is of course tourism. And nothing helped more than the hosting of the Football World Cup, the FIFA 2010, in South Africa, including down the road here in Port Elizabeth, or up the road, should I say, which happened in 2010. I mean, in that single event, for all the costs, which we can debate about till kingdom come, we saw a rise, and I was in charge of 3 football crazy nations, of 122% of tourists from my countries to this country in that period. Now, that was very easy to do, because every South American who had a few bucks and an interest wanted to be in South Africa for that month. The much more challenging thing was to use that platform for the years that followed, and what I was really much more interested in wasn't what happened in 2010, but what happened in 2011, the year after. And there the figures went up 70% between 2009 and 2011. So what we tried to do was to use these big events, whether it was the football in South Africa, the Springbok rugby test last year in Mendoza, which saw Argentina accede now on a permanent basis into the new Tri-Nations Rugby Championship, and that was now called the Rugby Championship, and that's permanently got Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa in it. And to use those events as multipliers. Every platform that's available has got to be used to add value to other opportunities. So, for example, here I was, Kersney College 7th 15, as I played without distinction in school, suddenly, being the orchestrator of the Springbok presence in Argentina. And it was great, all the guys, Jean de Villiers and Patrick Lambie, well, they kept him on the bench, probably why we put in our worst result ever against. Can I say that in the Kingdom of the Kings? I suppose I can. Mention a few other players. But, it's great to have them there, but just to have the Springboks for a 90-minute rugby match and a cocktail party and all that is not really going to do very much for the country. So we built a whole lot of series leading up to that, from trade seminars to tourism expositions, in order to maximize that event for the future, public diplomacy and economic opportunity around it. And that was, I think, pretty successful. And then the third area, which actually has direct relevance here, is, of course, bringing the South Americans into South Africa. Now, I know Athol is a farmer from Bedford, and I dare say one or two others in this very agri-rich province also have a lot of agricultural experience. I never knew, incidentally, until I went there, that our cattle, our Bonsmara cattle, had a problem called lumpy skin disease. In fact, other than his name, I had no idea what lumpy skin disease was. But I became an expert on lumpy skin disease, because that is the thing that is used by Argentina to keep our Bonsmara embryos and semen out of Argentina. Not that it really is an issue that can't be dealt with, but it's useful for them to say no rather than to say yes. And what we had to do was to make sure that they started saying yes more often than they said no. And that led me to another very, very interesting discovery, which has direct application here. You know, outside Buenos Aires, you've got the most fertile agricultural lands in the world, the Pampas. They're not just famous for being famous, you know, like Zaza Gabor was. They're famous because they got up to 20 feet of topsoil. I mean, it's unimaginable. They got almost permanent rainfall at the right time. And they're outside of the capital city and the port. So the lines of communication and linkages of transport are no problem at all. And the big game changer for Argentina, despite everything that's done wrong, is what happened in China. And what's happened in China, incidentally, is very interesting to all of us, for many reasons, good, bad, and indifferent, is that in 1990, the average Chinese person consumed 7 kilograms of meat a year. In 2010, the average Chinese person, through a process of enrichment and urbanization, is now consuming 50 kilograms of meat per annum. And the green gold, the actual cheapest form of animal protein, which is common to all animal feed, is of course soybeans and soy oil and soy cake and so on. And Argentina now produces 40% of the Chinese soy imports in the world. So it is much cheaper, it's much more profitable, it's much more sensible for the Argentine agri-producer to stop having cattle in these lush grasslands and start planting soy, as they do. And the cattle get pushed more and more to the north, and as they get pushed more and more to the north, the conditions are dry, and that's incidentally where our Bonsmara comes in, you see. So we suddenly started seeing that there was a real opportunity there. And the consequence of this extraordinary boom in agriculture was that Argentina had an almost endless need for fertilizer, particularly phosphate fertilizer, which they couldn't produce enough of locally. And so our game changer with our terms of trade was a surge in South African exports of fertilizer to Argentina. And it's in those nooks and crannies, even in a country as protectionist and adverse to imports as Argentina has become, that you can actually push the trade. Now, I equally have to say, I'm going to tell you a story of two big South African companies at the moment who we were very involved with. The one is SAB Miller, and the other one is Standard Bank. That if you've got these world-class multinationals like South Africa has, you don't really need an embassy. The embassy comes in when there's a problem with the government. Well, in Argentina, there are many problems with the government, so the embassy was quite engaged. But that's actually not really what a trade mission should be doing. The ambassador must do. What your trade section wants to do is to be the pilot fish, to look out for the opportunities for the small companies, the medium-sized companies in South Africa, who, absent of some kind of South African trade presence or diplomatic presence, would have no idea that there was a market opportunity in a place like South America. And I'm very pleased that we constantly were dealing with that all the time, particularly, incidentally, through our provincial trade offices. We were Eastern Cape, Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal. We were constantly sending information back, some of which was responded to, sometimes even on time, saying, look, here's an opportunity, here's a delegation, here's a trade show, come and show your wares. And when they did, they met with some success. Not always. I mean, one of the reasons I could say to President Zuma that South Africa, with all its challenges for business and economic growth, is an easier place than Argentina, was that we had a huge exhibition we arranged for South African fruit juices in Buenos Aires. It's one of the major supermarkets chains, but like Pick and Pay, the equivalent in Buenos Aires. And all these South African fruit juices were on display, and the next day, this is a true story incidentally, it's in the book, the manager of the supermarket chain got a call from the domestic trade secretary, who's the equivalent of the sort of minister of the trade and industry in Argentina. And he phoned personally, as he's very hands-on, micromanages the whole economy of Argentina, this guy. And he said to them, why is it that you are displaying those South African fruit juices at such a low cost? So he said, well, you know, that's the landed cost, and we're doing a big trade promotion with this South African company. So the Argentine minister said, I suggest you take those fruit juices off your shelves, or else we will find something in your warehouses that we will find you have violated one or another regulation. And that is what you call in mafia terms a shakedown. And so much of the economy that I represented with my very good South African colleagues operated on that basis. And yet, despite that, South African companies were doing quite well there in the thick of this very, very difficult situation. And one of those companies is Standard Bank. I mean, Argentina posted the biggest sovereign debt default in world economic history in 2001. It's a classic example of how to run the country into the ground. That's what they did then, and there's some challenges at the moment that suggest it might be going in a similar direction in the future. So for Standard Bank to go and buy a bank in Argentina 4 years after the biggest economic collapse in recent history in 2005 seemed a counterintuitive thing to do. And yet Standard Bank built this bank, branded it Standard Bank, got involved in sponsoring the Argentine football team, the Argentine Pumas rugby team, became the 7th biggest retail bank in South America, and last year sold that bank to the Chinese, the ICBC, the biggest bank in the world, for $650 million. A third company whose president, it's relevant to mention, does come from the Eastern Cape as well, is SAB Miller. Now, SAB Miller is a world leader. It's the 2nd biggest brewer in the world. It's a remarkably adept company, and they're just hugely impressive in the way they operate. But they also operate in a very challenging environment, and here's the thing. In Latin America, which starts in Mexico and goes all the way down to Antarctic, they only have 13% of the beer market, including a small brewery in Argentina, but they have, from that 13%, SAB Miller makes, listen to this, 33% of its global profits come from Latin America. It's an extraordinary ratio, that. 13% market share, 1/3 of your global profits. Which shows if you know what you're doing, if you get good market share in some countries or critical market share in others, you can make a very, very big dent. Now, the president of SAB Miller, the East Cape guy, who is appropriately married to a Colombian and speaks fluent Spanish, is Carl Lippert. And I was so impressed with this story that when we were arranging a big trade seminar on South Africa, we invited Carl to come from Bogota in Colombia to Buenos Aires to actually tell the story of how it's done. And I just want to read to you very briefly what he said, because I think there's some very interesting lessons. He says, actually, very much like Africa, Latin America is an environment for the hardy. Almost everywhere, populist governments are prone to creating business uncertainty. Although more sound today in terms of monetary policy and financial market stability, the South American and Latin American continent still has a lot of poverty, infrastructural decline, crime and corruption problems, and only, as he put it, a part-time interest in the property rights that underpin prosperous economies. We consider our origin in South Africa as a source of competitive advantage in becoming a global company. There are many cultures and 11 languages in South Africa. And so we recognize here in Latin America cultural diversity and the importance of sensitivity to local traditions. The beer market overwhelmingly consists of local darling brands, as he put it. And most countries believe their particular style of taste to be the best. So we believe that some of our competitors are misguided in foisting their international brands on local populations. And we see them waste fortunes in those efforts instead of actually looking at what the local market is about. And as he summed it up, local is lekker. And that is why, incidentally, although they've only got a small market share, but I'm sure with this marketing strategy, they bought the small brewery in Argentina called Casa Eisenberg. And I'm sure with that philosophy, with that approach, that hard-driving respect for local traditions, for sustainability, and for understanding their market, that they are going to grow and grow in Argentina, just as they have grown elsewhere on the continent. Now, all this leads me to a conclusion, though it's a very diverse place, Latin America. By 2020, South Africa, or Africa, is going to have a very, very significant uplift, our continent. It's going to consist of have a global or a continental GDP in Africa of about 3.9 trillion US dollars. It's estimated that per capita, on average, every African is going to have a income of around $5,000. That's on average. Obviously, some will have much less, and many will, or some will have far more than that. So those are the African figures, and we're impressed with that correctly because of where we come from. Listen to the same figures for Latin America. By 2020, the GDP of that region, Latin America, will be 10.7 trillion. It's almost 2.5 times Africa's. And the per capita GDP is going to be 12,000 US dollars. In other words, that is a huge market. It is a very big market. It's going to become a much bigger market. It's a market with a lot of snares and snakes and problems, but it's a very profitable one, as you've just heard. And the issue is, can you access it? Should you access it? And the answer clearly should be sí, as we say in Spanish. Now, it's not easy because we suffer from a barrier called language, idioma español y portuguesa. And some of you were troubled by my Afrikaans, and I got to tell you, my Spanish is much worse. Just when I retired from politics before I tackled the other 9 languages of South Africa, because that would have been very problematic. But I had to go and sell South African Spanish with some very hilarious results. I'll just tell you one of them in the book. I always suffered, because I suppose my mother told me that I was clever, which was a big mistake. I always suffered from a sort of false sense of overconfidence. It helps if you were leading the opposition in South Africa at difficult moments. And so I sort of was taking Spanish lessons. I thought, I'm an okay speaker. I'll just go out there and talk, because I kind of understand more or less the stock phrases I had to learn. So one night, not so long after our arrival, we arranged a spectacular evening with 2 of the great South African operatic talents, Pretty Yende, a fantastic opera singer, and her partner, Given Nkosi. We bring them to Argentina. We've got the South African warship, the SAS Drakensberg. We use the deck as a platform. We invite 250 Argentines, a lot of businesses. We want to show off, our talent. And we've got a big signing ceremony next day of the defense agreement to Lindiwe Sisulu and Nilde Garay, the Argentine Minister of Defense. And we're having a Nelson Mandela exhibition. We've got a dozen events called the South Africa Festival in Argentina. So this now is the launch. And I, soy el embajador de Sudáfrica, I stand up and I say, buenas noches, damas y caballeros. And there's a guffaw in the audience. And suddenly it just dawns on me in that terrible moment that I've mistaken the word caballeros for caballeros, which sounds like nothing except the difference between horses and gentlemen. So I said, good evening, ladies and horses. You will understand, incautious and improvident though I am, sometimes, I thereafter never spoke Spanish without the script and without spending many hours with my translator rehearsing it beforehand. So that's one of the stories that I like to tell, because it applies to some of the extraordinary adventures I was privileged to participate in, some of them being more hair-raising than others. But let me leave you with one thought. And Dawn said, say something about local politics. Well, they're very articulate local politicians. They don't need me to speak, but I've got some views. But I tell you one thing about Argentina, of the lessons I think to avoid. When I said at the beginning of my remarks that in the 1930s Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, it's true. That's one of the least successful economies, almost become an economic outlaw today. That's also true. What happened in between those years is a matter of contemplation in my book, both about South Africa and Argentina in these pages. But the chapter on Argentine politics I called Vote for a Better Yesterday. And I did that deliberately because the entire prism of Argentine politics is through the lens of what is called Peronism. And Peronism is not a reference so much to a political ideology as a cult of two people, Juan Domingo Perón and his second wife, Eva Duarte Perón, known universally as Evita. And it was interesting to me when I went to look at the presidential election, which is, as always with Argentina, was won by a Peronist called Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. And some of my more hair-raising accounts with her are inside here. We had an unbelievable meeting with her when F.W. de Klerk came to Argentina with Mac Maharaj, and I tell the story of that here, but if I tell you the story now, you won't go and buy the book, which will defeat the purpose for my publisher tonight. But on election day, I was, a bit of a political junkie. I also used to appear with my picture on the ballot paper next to the DA. I don't think they talk about now the DA, but it was my photograph next to the DA slogan, or symbol. But an inconvenient truth, as we say. But I went and I had a look because I'm always interested in politics and elections. And the symbol in 2010 of the Partido Justicialista, the Justicialist Party, which is the Peronist Party, was a picture of President Juan Domingo Perón, deceased 1974, and Eva Perón, deceased 1952. And one of the crowning failures of the country I was in, for all the huge successes it has, is that its politics, instead of appointing itself for the future, is a fixation on the past. And so I came to the conclusion, if I might offer this thought, we should always honor the past, but we can't live in it. And the countries that have succeeded in South America are those who have a future orientation, not looking back in anger or in pleasure at their past accomplishments or tragedies. And so it's not unique to South Africa, but I think it's a lesson, if I might offer it, for South Africa. And let me just take this one step further. I mean, the big disconnect in Argentina is a country that has produced remarkable people. This year alone, 3 of them. The first non-European Pope in the world is an Argentine, Francis I. The greatest footballer in the world for the 4th year running is an Argentine called Lionel Messi. And the new Queen of the Netherlands is an Argentine called Princess Maxima. So here's one country, 40 million people, a long way away, that produces such remarkable people. But I've got to conclude with a story, because much of being an ambassador is living up to the philosophy of one of my favorite philosophers, Woody Allen. Woody Allen said, doesn't just produce movies, he's a very clever man, he said, much of the success in life is just about showing up. So, shortly after I get to Buenos Aires, I arrive in my office and my secretary says, embajador, she always insists on calling me embajador. Very important function tonight. I said, most diplomatic functions are a complete waste of time. That's another secret I distill in this book. And she said, I said, why? She said, one of your bosses is presiding. I said, who's my boss? Because Argentina, a very good place for a Jewish chap, is 97% Catholic. She said, the head of the diplomatic corps is the papal nuncio, the Vatican's ambassador. So you should go, but just pay your respects. So I go. He lives in a marvelous palace, just in the best part of Buenos Aires, beautiful Palacio. And the first person I meet there is the Cardinal of Buenos Aires. Very nice man. We start a long conversation, about Mandela and Tutu, South Africa, and his name is Jorge Bergoglio. Anyway, I shake his hand, we chat, and I move on. Little known to me, him or indeed the President of Argentina, he became, of course, Pope Francis I earlier this year. And so, you never know who you're going to meet. You come here tonight to the Daily Dispatch Forum, you might meet someone who's going to be hugely significant in the future. The next Premier of the Eastern Cape, maybe. But anyway, I don't know. But here's the thing about that story. Every year, come Argentine Independence Day, the whole diplomatic corps was assembled with the government of Argentina to accompany the president to a religious ceremony called the Te Deum. Every year we went anywhere so long as it wasn't Buenos Aires. Because Buenos Aires, the cathedral, is directly opposite the president's office. It's sort of literally from here to across the road. But Cardinal Bergoglio was regarded as an enemy of the president because he was critical of her government. So we used to fly off to godforsaken places 2 hours away where there'd be more friendly bishop or cardinal to bless the president. So she wouldn't set foot in his cathedral. Bergoglio becomes Pope Francis I, and Christina, as the president's universe known, gets into a plane and flies all the way from Buenos Aires to Rome in order to go and kiss his hand. So as Peter Dirk Ace once memorably said, he said, hypocrisy is the Vaseline that greases our politics. Let me tell you something, it is a universal lesson as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. We wish you could just keep on hearing you speaking. You speak so well. Sounds so good. Okay, we're going to have reflections now from Herman. Mashaba, I'm going to give over to him to come and comment on whatever he has in his mind, but of course also on the book and Tony's presentation of the book. Let's give our hands to Herman Mashaba.
Yes, good evening. Cold Eastern Cape. I'm actually sitting there, almost freezing. I was in Johannesburg yesterday, attended a function, and equally freezing. It looks like as South Africans, we're not actually geared up for the winter season. And I think it's a really high time that the South Africans, we need to learn to adapt, because if we don't adapt, we die. And these are some of the issues that actually Tony was referring to. So thank you very much to Daily Dispatch for this invitation to the Eastern Cape, East London, and to Fort Hare University for this great invitation. When Dawn first extended an invitation, as usual, tried to find every reason to decline, but unfortunate enough for me, she just was not prepared to give up, and one day cornered me at the time when I was vulnerable, and obviously to get rid of her was to accept the invitation. And here it is, I'm here, and I really feel so humbled and honored to be invited to the town that actually helped to shape my capitalist life. Because I always actually tell people in this country how capitalist I am, and the Eastern Cape and East London in particular played such a great role in 1985 to reinforce this, because I remember quite well and actually tell people this, that the day August 1959 when I jumped out of my mother's body, I knew I was a capitalist. And it's something that I find actually quite strange as South Africans, that our people sometimes are actually quite apologetic for being who they are, and actually I cannot understand how someone can apologize for wanting to do something for himself and his family. It's actually, for me, it's really something that even today, I'm battling to find the answers to it. But I think it comes from a historical perspective, and I think something that we've got to accept. But obviously, coming back to the Eastern Cape, why East London, it's so special to my life. And actually, I should have brought you a copy of the book, because I wrote the book about my life, which I launched last year. The first big order I received when I started Black Like Me in 1985 was here in East London. There was a guy called Andile Jamele, Ampor. We got a call from this guy. And actually at the time we did not even have telephones in our factory. And this guy gave us our first big order, 25,000 rands. We just could not believe. We thought this guy's playing some games with us. So, and obviously because we didn't really know him and trust him, because fortunate enough also I've never really lived a naive life. I don't really take things for granted. So we said, Mr. Jamel, if you want to supply, give us the money, here's our bank account, put the money in our account, and obviously also not really trusting. He said, no, guys, we've got to work this one out. So we agreed we'll deliver the stock to you. Actually, 2-3 bakkies. We had 3 partners. We had 1-ton bakkies and drove all the way, left Johannesburg on Sunday. We got to King Williamstown, 6 o'clock on Monday morning. We met him in King Williamstown and delivered the stock to him. But we said, before we go into Dansani, the township to go and deliver, let's go and put the cash in the bank. So obviously showed us the cash. So we came to Standard Bank in East London, we deposited the money with him, and then from there then we went to Dansani to go and deliver. But then what was interesting about this discovery for me, this guy Ambor, well known in the region as a rugby player. Can you imagine? I think for me, black South African, born and brought up in Pretoria, rugby, what is this? I had absolutely no idea. So for the first time, and I actually keep telling people, it was one of those discoveries in my life to see black people playing rugby, and not actually playing rugby, passionately in love with the sport. It was really one of those perceptions that I had, because before that I never really thought black people ever even discuss rugby, because in my life that rugby only existed by reading about this, but I did not know what rugby was all about. So, and I'm fortunate enough, the women and a few men of the Eastern Cape were ready to be paid. And Andile and I paid them, and in the process we made a lot of money. So thank you very much, Eastern Cape. Thank you very much for really giving me this opportunity to be the capitalist I was born to become. And I really hope and trust that you can really produce more of the Herman Mashabas. Don't just really leave it to us people from Johannesburg to really be the ones actually playing a role in the economic field. Actually was quite disturbed earlier on listening to Don telling us on the way here the employment situation in the Eastern Cape, that many years ago, the motor industry used to really be the biggest employer. And we look at it today, who's the biggest employer? It's government. I think, for me as a South African, as a human being, I feel actually it's actually indictment of our failure as society, because anywhere in the world where you expect government to really be the biggest employer, then you must know that country is on a path to failure. Because the government can only consume, cannot really create. If we need creation of the economy, to creation of any society, you need the business community to really be that key player in our society. So I really have to really find a way to reverse the situation. When I was also asked to comment about Tony's talk, and I found it quite interesting, Don sent me the book which I was in Europe a few weeks ago to address free marketers from all over the world. So I had an opportunity in the plane to really read this book. And interesting enough, last week I was in Mpumalanga, on my way to Mpumalanga, I flew to Durban. At the airport, I had 2 hours waiting period, catching my flight from Nelspruit to Durban. And I went into the bookstore and bought a book by one economist, one great human being called Neil Ferguson. And interesting enough, which is in Tony's book, the book called Why Nations Fail. I've got such interest in this type of subjects. lately, for the last 5 years or so, I want him to really understand as to why do other people in the world make it and others actually fail? And what is interesting about the issues that Tony is raising and Neil Ferguson and all the economists in the world actually raises, I fail to understand, all of us as South Africans, particularly our political leadership, as to why we actually fail to understand why we fail as nations. And relating precisely to South America, how prosperous this region was until North America came to actually overtake them. But then at the same time, I'm really looking at it, particularly myself from a South African perspective. One thing I believe as South Africa, we just cannot really afford to fail. I don't really believe that we need to really put a failure in our vocabulary, because we've got a lot at stake, that if we fail, we have a lot to answer to our children and their children. I've actually really committed my life as a South African, as a human being, that I'd like to really avoid a situation where one day I must say to my kids, I saw what was happening and I did nothing. And I really call on all of us as South Africans, let us actually engage, because the only way that this country is going to succeed is for us to engage, particularly with our political leadership, so that they understand that all of us as citizens, we've got a right. Because all the societies that have ever made it in the history of mankind are those where there's aggressive, robust engagement of public service and the people. For as long as people obviously take things for granted, then that's obviously a recipe for disaster in any given situation. And I don't really believe South Africa, being the last country in the world to really be liberated from the oppressive system of apartheid, that we can really let this beautiful country collapse. And all of us as civil society, we've got to take responsibility for it. I was born and brought up in an environment where I always believed that for me, I needed to really have my independence. And that independence, I knew if it had to really come, it can only come from me. It's not going to come from anyone else. But then I'm surrounded by a sea of bodies and individuals who actually believe that their success is going to really come from government. And I think you can only be naive to think that government is going to do it for you, because it's actually one of those dreams that will never happen. History has taught us so many times that governments are not capable of delivering anything to the people than really for them to really provide the essential services. The government has to play the role as a referee, not to really be the player, more especially when it comes to economic development, and which this country and this continent so much look up to. I think I remember quite well in the 80s when I started going into business, quite young in my age, my life, and really very aggressive, wanted to really see what was happening. And I went on a massive traveling spree. I thought I wanted to actually finish the world before apartheid collapses. In fact, I never even at some stage when we discussed amongst ourselves, we never thought apartheid would collapse in our lifetime. But I had an opportunity because of my capitalist tendencies, made money when black South Africans were fast asleep. I used the opportunity to travel the world. But what is interesting about my travels at the time, obviously really learning, it was difficult or impossible at the time to really share with the world that you are a South African. Every time I was anywhere in the world, I would really make sure that I avoid to people knowing where I came from, because it was quite difficult to really explain this background and country was coming from. Evil society, something which the world had obviously declared as crime against humanity. So I do not really want to really be associated with that system. And fortunately enough, 1989 came, the Berlin Wall falling, the Eastern Bloc, Russia collapsed, and that really helped to facilitate our liberation with the release of our political prisoners, and really South Africa became the talk of the world. And all of a sudden, really proud human being, proud South African. And everyone attracted the attention of the world. And I'm sure all of us are aware how South Africa was dearly loved by the world. And this lasted for about, almost 10 years? But the last 10 years, this is really becoming a challenge again, particularly the last 5 years, where I still travel and I still travel quite extensively. I'm in that environment again where I'm now not prepared to really let people know that I come from South Africa, because they asked very difficult questions that I don't want to really get involved and engage in. And I'm asking myself, as a South African, at the age of, I'll be 54 in August, that you live through these transitions. And I'd really like to really be proud of myself. I know as a human being, I love myself. That's the reason why I used Blade Like Me as a brand to reflect that. But then you've got a challenge where you obviously become ashamed of really being a South African, which is really quite unfortunate. And I think these are the things that I always try and really engage everyone in South Africa, be political leaders, business leaders, civil society. Let's ensure that I think this trend cannot really continue any longer. I think we've got a responsibility. We need to really grow the economy of this country so that we can really deal with the challenges that our country faces. In particular, high unemployment. I'm sure for some of you who read and follow the press, I've already been very staunch critic of our high unemployment, in particular as relates to our labor legislation. I started this query some 10 years ago, in fact more than that, because at the time when Tito Mboweni was the Minister of Labor, I once actually interrupted him one day having a meeting with the labor unions, because I was having totally unacceptable situation with staff. And one day approached him, I said, Mr. Mboweni, what you guys are creating is going to really hurt this country. And that's what, almost 15 years or even longer. And what has happened 20 years into our democracy, or 18, 19 years into our democracy, we sit with unemployment, which is actually one of the highest in the world. Are we happy and proud as South Africans to really be in that situation? We are affected not just really as human beings, we are affected by our family members, because I always challenge any South African who can tell me is not affected by high unemployment in their own immediate families. I always tell people that I think if you want to really do a research on the state of unemployment, come and talk to me. You can do a research just within my own immediate family. You look at kids, I'd really call them kids, 18 to 30 bracket. You really look at what's really happening to them. It's really this situation creating massive social challenges for all of us in society. Because what is happening with these kids who see their fathers and their mothers for 5-10 years not really working. So it's really creating massive instability in our communities. And now do we really then blame these kids now to using the alcohol and drugs to relieve themselves? You know, I always, also at the same time, always warn the working class of South Africa that, guys, just really bear in mind, this country is not just really made out of the working people. We've got 7 million South Africans, half of them being youth. 65% of being black youth that are not really working. So are we as a country really prepared to really take and accept the consequences of our action by ignoring their plight? And I think we make the mistake because we believe we can solve high unemployment situation in our country by passing one draconian legislation after the other, by forcing business people to employ when they cannot really afford it. I think you don't have to really be an economist or record scientist to actually really understand that as a business person, you can only pay what you can afford. You don't really need legislation to tell you that. You don't need government to tell you. that. And at the same time, I don't really believe you need government to really tell you that you need to keep your people. Because for me as a businessman, to really make money, I know I need to employ people. And for me to really keep those people, it's expensive to train people and I cannot afford to lose them. So the only way you can guarantee that people are fully employed, then create full employment in the country by not really pushing one legislation after the other. This morning, I released a statement as chairman of the Free Market Foundation, in particular in relation to what might happen tomorrow in Parliament, where we're talking about actually even banning labor brokers. If you look at it as a business person, who wants to really use labor brokers to employ people? But then we're not asking ourselves as a country, why do business people prefer the route of labor brokers? Because of the draconian labor legislation that we're sitting with. And now I'm concerned as South African that tomorrow that we might have even passed more draconian legislation. Then another million people who are employed through the labor brokers are going to be casualties. When I ask myself this question as South Africans, why do we always keep actually punishing poor, vulnerable people? Because the kind of legislation like that can only punish poor, unemployed people, and most of them are being black South Africans. Because, as I said, we don't have to be a rocket scientist to really know that a legislation like that is going to lead to more and more South Africans being unemployed. And the consequences of this, the whole world is actually watching us. We know a few weeks ago, the World Economic Forum on competitiveness just released the 2013 report, where we're doing well on other aspects of our country's situation, because we're not really failing in all aspects. Our banking really being regarded as really one of those most advanced in the world. Corporate governance, it's really one of those issues that the world actually admires about our country. But at the labor front, where the majority of our poor people are victims of, we're failing badly. Out of 144 countries, we number 144. Can we really be proud of a rating like this? When we sit with such high unemployment in our country, we need to find innovative, creative ways on ensuring that our people are employed. And obviously really learn from Tony's experience, because I think listening to him articulating his experiences, and not just really articulating so well, the passion that he's got. And I'm saying to myself, why as a country can't we really use such resources in helping us to really correct the ills of our society? Because we do. It's not that this country does not really have the capacity. We do have the capacity, but it's a question of how we use that capacity. And I believe all of us as South Africans really need to really focus on this, because I've actually lived this situation myself. In 1984, when I conceived the idea of using Black Like Me, as a trader, dropping out of university in the second year of my studies, I became a door-to-door salesman selling from the boot of my car. And I have this idea and dream that I need to pimp these black women so that I can make money out of them. Did I have the expertise to produce haircare products? I'd never obviously worked in a factory before in my life. Did I have the right white skin to deal with officialdom? Unfortunately not. But I decided at the age of 23, 24, that, you know what, this system, I'm going to manipulate it, I'm going to operate and adapt. And brought in my white South Africans who shared the same dreams as I do, to say, look, you know what, guys, you know I can sell the stuff, black women out there are ready to be pimped. You can manufacture the stuff, you've got the right skin tone that can help to deal with the National Party evil system. Please, guys, let's join force together. And that's exactly what we did. It's really not just really a question of obviously looking at issues from a political point of view. And now here is it 30 years, almost 30 years later. I've got my liberation, I've got my freedom, I've got the capacity actually play a role, probably much more than what politicians can do, using my own resources in helping society. So I think if economic freedom is actually what we want. And one thing that I can assure you and let the world know that when it comes to the financial resources and money has got no color. I've never really personally found discrimination in the last odd years of my business career because I've never allowed it. And I was born and grew up at the age of 14, 15, that almost turned me into a criminal by being a big gambler, because I used to have this perception that white people are evil creatures. I had this perception for most of my youth. That's why I turned into gambling, because I did not want contact with white people, because I thought they were evil creatures. Until when I started working and interacting with people, only to realize that it's actually the political system that creates this nonsense, that creates this perception. And I think for us as South Africans, we've got to be very, very careful about this, because politicians have got their own ways of really driving the perception that they can get the outcome of. And that's something that South Africans we've got to be very careful about, and really urge all of you as South Africans, as civil society, to start really doing something about it. So thanks very much for this opportunity to talk to you, not as a capitalist, as chairman of the Free Market Foundation. But what is this Free Market Foundation? Interesting enough, 18 months ago, after having many months of sleepless nights, really not knowing what to do. And I think for me, as a member of civil society, I said, what role can I play in making sure that I can stop this train from crashing with us? And I decided and opted to actually approach and call Leon Law, who is the executive director of this foundation. I've been a financial founder of this organization for many years, because obviously they promote the ideas that are so close to my heart. I called Leon, I said, Leon, what's happening? How can we make sure that we take this organization to the next level? I know you've been doing a fantastic job for the last 37 years, but I think it's a high time that we really take the Free Market Foundation to another level. And really, for my sins, I ended up taking over the chairmanship of this beautiful organization that is there to promote and foster open society, to promote the rule of law, because we know as the free marketers, there's just no way that there can be any business activity without the rule of law. An example of what Tony just said about an incident where he was with a businessman in Argentina, where there was political interference. And those are some of the challenges that I think we believe the rule of law is so critical. And civil liberties and property ownership. In an environment where you really have stability in your country, that's when there is uncertainty about property. If you want business people to invest and to create economic activity in your country, make sure that there's property ownership stability. And that's something that I believe as a country, it's really quite lacking. And I think for us as a Free Market Foundation, those are some of the aspects that we really like to promote, because we know eventually our people will, poor people will benefit out of that, because there'll be economic activity. And at the same time, what we want to see is less government in our lives. I'm a strong believer in saying to a government, we elect you in power, but we want you to stay away from our lives. And that's really something that we really like to really promote in this country, because then we'll really be a proud nation, we'll really be a proud world citizens, and we can really reclaim what Nelson Mandela and some of his colleagues obviously aspire to have. And let us all take the responsibility for it. I believe as a country and as a people, we've got the capacity. Thank you very much for listening to me, and really look forward to engagement in the future. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Mashaba. We have now come to interaction, questions, comments, and we will take views from the floor. Please, let's engage the gentleman. We are focusing, of course, on the book, The Accidental Ambassador by Tony Leon, and of course, very thought-provoking points raised by Mr. Mashaba on issues of unemployment. And let's engage the gentleman. There are revolving mics. that are going around. So if you want to make your point, please lift up your hand. Let's stick to the questions. Be brief, be concise, and just make sure that we give all other people an opportunity. If you speak too long, I will stop you. That's my job as an MC. So please, let's allow questions. I can see some hands over here. 1, 2, I thought I saw 3 hands. Okay, that's 1, 2. The young man there on.
Good evening, my name's Thomas. I had a question, first of all, for Tony Leon. It's on the BRICS and South Africa's participation in BRICS. What I wanted to ask you is, in your opinion, do you think that South Africa has failed Africa as a continent in terms of its economic development as a member of the BRICS summit? And do you think that there are ways in which we can improve this role to increase economic development in Africa?
Yeah, well, can I speak from here? Yeah, well, thank you very much, Thomas. Very good question. Let me say that South Africa's accession into BRICS is actually an achievement of the Zuma presidency, of which a lot of people were saying that the current foreign policy of South Africa is really, as a former ambassador said, care and maintenance of the project started by Thabo Mbeki in the international world. And I think getting into BRICS is, if you want to be in those sort of forums, it's a useful one to be in. That being said, by our own admission, we're in BRICS really as a proxy for Africa, because Africa is not at that table, and we were regarded as being the biggest and the most developed economy in Africa. But that's by no means a certainty. In fact, it's estimated by 2014 on current projections, Nigeria will soon have a bigger economy than South Africa's in Africa. So are we giving the right economic lessons to the world? The short answer is no, but I have to tell you, all the BRICS countries are in varying degrees of trouble. I mean, Brazil, which is a huge performer in the world, I mean, Brazil is a country of staggering size. It's got 8 million square kilometers, it's got a population of 200 million, it's got a GDP of 2.5 trillion. It's the 6th biggest economy in the world. But Brazil's growth rate last year was only 0.9%, which might be familiar. It's the South African growth rate for the first quarter of this year. And that's down from about 7 or 8% the year before. So a lot of the economic, I think, policy mistakes we're making are being made in Brazil. That wasn't the case until recently, is now. Russia has become, next to Argentina, is the most protectionist country in the world, and Russia is seriously challenged because, like us and a lot of other countries, it's really banked on its resources, oil and gas particularly. As you know, America is now going for aggressive shale gas drilling, which is going to change its dependency and Europe's dependency on Russian oil and gas, which I think could be a big change there. And India. Now, India is the most interesting to me because India is a bit of everything. It's such a big economy, big country. But there's a very interesting book written recently by an Indian economist who used to be the head of Procter & Gamble there, which he entitled the most fantastic title, Herman will appreciate, calls India Grows at Night. And the explanation for the author is India grows at night while the government sleeps. That is true. Now, in answer to your question, you know, we've done many things right in South Africa, particularly, as Herman said, in the early years of our democracy, we adopted a sensible macroeconomic platform. We democratized appropriately and long overdue, and we started, you know, building an inclusive society. Since then, as the challenges have mounted, we've tended to go for short-term, stopgap populist measures. And, you know, that won't make us uncomfortable at the BRICS table as such, because there are quite a few other countries doing that as well. But it's not actually really, I think, going to advantage this continent as a whole. That's my view, of course, but I think the record is speaking for itself right now. And that is why our position in Africa, economically at least, is being challenged by other countries. Nigeria, I've mentioned. Ghana is coming up in the world, also doing some remarkable things. And even Kenya, Kenya, which was an economic laggard for the last 30 years, is now, you know, ahead of South Africa in areas like innovation at the moment. And that to me is not the sort of competition we should be losing.
Okay, we're going to be taking 3 questions at a go so that the panel will then respond to them so that we allow a more flow of discussion. So I'm going to take you, sir, and if we can have maybe two others, so that you indicate by your hand so that we could line you up, so that after him, you shoot also. Go ahead.
So my name is Tim. So my question is for you, Mr. Mashaba. So I want to know what scale is your business at international level? At what scale is your business at international level? And my second question is, what kind of advice can you give to the local emerging entrepreneurs to enter such markets? And one more question for you, Mr. Leon. Did you ever have ambitions of becoming a South African president?
Is there any other question? Okay, the gentleman at the back. Lift your hand again, sir, so that they see.
Good evening. My name is Mr. George. Mr. Leon, we always pride ourselves as a country that has got potential in agricultural production in South Africa. Do you think from the lesson that we have learned from Argentina, you talked about soybean, the big market in China and so on. Do you think that without subsidies to our local farmers, South Africa stands a chance to compete with agri-products from other countries in the world? And if so, if not so, what are the strategies that we can use? Because we always still proud ourselves with our surplus land and potential in agriculture, which has not yet been tapped in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have the opportunity to speak to my friend Mr. Leon often, so I won't put a question to him. I'd like to ask Mr. Mashaba. Mr. Mashaba, some time ago, nearly 3 years ago, the President made an announcement about a youth wage subsidy. It was embraced and endorsed by Pravin Gordhan. Some 3 years later, the youth wage subsidy is still moribund. At Mangaung recently, the ANC came back and said they're going to change it because of pressure from COSATU that they didn't want a youth wage subsidy, because COSATU represents people who are in work, not people who are out of work. And ironically, many of the COSATU members' children are out of work. And young people in the marketplace are aggressive, they work for harder for less, so they're a threat to union members. What is your opinion about the position that the government has taken to change the youth wage subsidy, which is an incentive to business to create jobs, and turn it into a jobs fund, job seekers fund? Because as far as I'm concerned, it reinforces the dependency syndrome that the government entrenches in society.
Okay, I think we can respond to those for now. Mr. Mashaba, the state of your business and how can entrepreneurs enter, young entrepreneurs enter that level where you're at now?
Okay, state of my business, I'm sure if the people follow the media, what happened in, just to really give you a little bit of background, in 17th of November 1993, someone decided to torch my factory just on the eve of our democracy, a few months before our elections. That really put some serious strain in my life, and how I survived that fire and that tragedy. It's obviously the matter of interest by business schools all over the world. That's why I get invited to come and share this, because 1st of July 1997 ended up selling my business to Colgate because I needed capacity. And 2 years later, or 18 months down the line, the marriage didn't really work out. My business just refused to be part of a big company. And made an announcement, called my corporate advisors to announce to Colgate that they buy the balance of the 25%. And I've really been a very lucky capitalist, because 6 months later ended up being the one buying the 75% back from Colgate. Something obviously historic for me that never thought possible, but you actually really learn the aspects of this. So brought the business back, and 2005 I sold it again. Discovered an opportunity as a capitalist that you just don't make money by paying women. You can also make money by selling and buying businesses. You sell them at a higher price and then you buy them back at a cheaper price. And that's really what has really been happening to my life and my business career. So 2005, I sold my business again to another company and closed down my manufacturing facility because of stringent draconian labor legislation, outsourced my manufacturing. And really quite a painful experience in my life where some of the people that worked for me 15, 18 years that I had to really retrench, but unfortunately I just could not really deal with the environment any longer. And for me as a business person, I'm not in business for social reasons. I'm in business to make money, like any businessman anywhere in the world. The social aspects happen once I've made the money. That's the reason why I can participate. There's a reason why I'm in a fortunate position that today that I can use some of the proceeds that I've made out of the money to really get involved in social programs. So I still got a share in the business, and my wife looks after that investment on my behalf. So I still have a share and association with the business, but I don't have the responsibility any longer to deal with CCMA matters and all those issues. And I think it's really quite unfortunate. I'm not really saying this obviously joking. I think it's a pain, it's a hate that I've experienced the last 15 years where I've seen to my peers I grew up with, I used to do business with in the 80s and early 90s and so forth, see how this draconian labor legislation took them out of business. And I was just really lucky that I had the capacity to always fight back. But majority of black business guys, entrepreneurs in the townships couldn't really deal with this. And, it really took them out of business. That's why I feel as a privileged South African that I can't sit back and watch this trajectory continue. So I still have an association with the business. My wife looks after that investment on my behalf, and I own the business with other shareholders.
And the issue of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs wanting to enter, advice?
I think, for me, entrepreneurs in this country, I feel so sad about it because the climate is not conducive. Sorry to really keep emphasizing on this labor regime because it really so responsible for stifling small entrepreneurs. If you look at one issue that I'm sure South Africans are aware, as a Free Market Foundation, we just launched the legal case against the bargaining councils, where we have a situation in this country where you have this big the business and big trade unions conniving to agree on conditions of employment for their particular sectors. And these agreements, once they are signed, contracts are given to the Minister of Labor, who then imposes them on everyone else. With a guy in Tanzania who has absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of what he needs to do. It has nothing to do with those contracts that are actually being forced on them. And how do I then expect the guys to operate in that environment? I've witnessed a guy with a wheelbarrow wanting to build your wall around, and where you'll have these bargaining councils harassing them because he expects this guy that is happy to really build the price that you and him are happy with. His employees are happy with the arrangement, but unfortunately we've got an intervention from the bargaining councils in terms of the small businessmen to comply with the conditions of employment that are applicable to big companies. And I've seen this situation happening in so many sectors of the South African economy that I'm actually finding it difficult to advise entrepreneurs any longer. The best thing that I felt I must do is to obviously fight the fight on their behalf. But at the end of the day, I expect people not to give up. Just really find a niche somewhere else, like I found a niche during the dark days of this country's history. You can imagine 1984 when I thought of starting Black Like Me. P.W. Botha said he's mad. Totally mad. We lived under one state of emergency after the other, and I had to really find a way. But at the same time, I'm not naive to believe that all of us can survive out of exceptions. We really need to make sure that we mass produce entrepreneurs. Instead of talking about creating 5 million jobs, we've always said, let's create 5,000 entrepreneurs, and those are the ones that can really create those jobs. But, and it looks like as a country, we're not really seeing that situation.
Okay, we'll come back to you again, Mr. Mashaba. Let's go over to Tony.
Let me deal with
You want to deal with youth? Okay.
deal with the issue of the
Youth subsidies.
It's also another interesting debate raging in the country around with youth waste subsidy. I've obviously really made clear for me as a free market, as a capitalist, I don't really believe in government doing anything for people. I expect government to create the environment for us, all of us, to really be players. In a country like ours with such high corruption happening, I cannot really see how this youth subsidy will be supervised, will be executed without the corruption. So I'm really very concerned. It's a great, noble idea, but has the country got the capacity to execute it? I honestly and truly doubt this very much because of the level of corruption that is there. I think we cannot afford to have a situation where people are going to see a business opportunity by exploiting this. Unless politicians can convince me that they've got systems in place to prevent corruption from taking a big percentage of this money. And I can assure you, I'll be one of those South Africans that you're going to find not easy to really be convinced that I can trust politicians with money.
Okay. Just to answer the questions that were addressed to me, well, first of all, just confidentially to let you know that Herman did say to me an answer to his business success that his hairstyle is not a consequence of 30 years of using Black Like Me hair products. So don't be put off them, please. Well, did I want to become president? I suppose the short answer was yes, but, you know, I'm a Democrat and we came second, not first, and the person who comes first becomes the president. But the slightly longer answer, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll keep it short. You know, it all depends on where you start from. When I was being made leader of my party, we were 5th. And then we got it to 2nd place. And now my successor's job is to make sure that she becomes the president. Otherwise, you know, you've got to then make sure that someone else can lead you to political success. But, you know, it depends where you start from. It depends what your aims are. I do think that it's not a zero-sum game, in the sense that you can win power in South Africa nationally, and then you become president. You can win power provincially, become a premier. You can win power locally, become a mayor. And all these are nice positions, but the great test is, what do you do with the positions? Do you just occupy them, or usurp them, or do you put into practice the policies and principles that you think can make a difference to change things? And I guess the disappointment I have isn't on a personal level, but I really would like to have had the opportunity to put into practice things that I could only talk about or preach about without being able to implement them. And that is the hope that I have, not personally, that South Africa will have a chance to experience some other policy options in practice rather than just being spoken about. And then the question of, can you have successful agriculture without subsidies, I think was the question. Well, the short answer to that question is yes and no. I mean, let me start with a no. There are very few countries in the world which don't subsidize agriculture for a whole range of reasons, usually bad, incidentally. I mean, the bad reasons are there's a romantic idea about food security, which is a concern, but food is a global commodity. The probably better reason is, particularly in Europe, is they believe the only way you will actually retain people on land is to make it subsidized. But that, of course, will provide subsidies. That becomes absolutely grotesque. I once read a study that said every cow in Europe could be flown around the world in a chartered jumbo jet for the equivalent of the subsidy that every farmer gets per head of cattle, some such extraordinary figure. So, and the United States is also a big subsidizer, and that is why when you have the primary election, and always first in the calendar, Iowa, there are very few Republicans who are meant to be of the free market persuasion who will take on the ethanol and the corn subsidy supporters in those states, those agri-states like Iowa, precisely because so many of the constituents are beneficiaries from them. So it's not a unique thing. South Africa well, South Africa has various forms of subsidies, but they are very modest compared to some of the jurisdictions I've mentioned. And here's the thing about Argentina, which is this fantastically successful agri-exporting nation. The one thing it really does well. In Argentina, they don't incentivize farming, they tax it into the ground. They have a retention tax of 35% for soybean exports. So before because the one thing they can actually see is the bales of soy, actually, or whatever soy comes in, excuse my ignorance, that are leaving the port. Because a lot of the Olympic sport in Argentina is not to pay your income tax. So the one thing that they can actually do is to tax the exporters of commodities, and they do it 35% of the land price or cost is what they have to pay the farmers, and still it's very profitable. So, that's a counter example. Now, to answer your question very briefly, and it's a very big question, important one, I think, South Africa doesn't tax its farming exports. South Africa does provide some level, depending on where you are and who you are, of subsidies. Probably it's a very distorting thing. What can we do? Well, the one example that I'm very proud of, it, we brought an Argentine, the biggest fresh citrus company, into South Africa, called SA San Miguel, which bought a lot of ranch lands in the Sundays River Valley outside Port Elizabeth. And they did it because they identified South Africa because of our conditions here and the access to export markets we have, and our rule of law, and our property rights jurisdiction, all the things that now are perhaps a little more challenged right now, as being the ideal headquarters for this international citrus firm, this Argentine firm, for its global orange production. So we've got a lot of market access in the Middle East. We've got very good trade access in Europe and in the United States, which countries like Argentina simply don't have. So I think that is a way that we can incentivize. But then on the other hand, we mustn't ban foreigners from owning land in South Africa if we want them to come here and start taking advantage of our export policies and to create jobs and to create enterprises. I do think we can also, and I'll conclude with this, I think there's an enormous amount that we can import in terms of technology and know-how to improve our agricultural yields. I'm a big proselytizer I've become of something called no-till cultivation. There's some resistance to it here. It does require a certain adaptation. I think South America and North America have shown that it can be a game changer in terms of agri-production.
Right, we'll take more questions. There's two hands on my right, or three. One in front, 2 and 3. Gentleman with the white, can you please stand, sir, so that they see you?
Would you mind to sit down?
Okay, you can sit down, it's fine.
My question will be to Mr. Tony Leon, and I'll have a comment for Mr. Mashaba. Let me start with Mr. Mashaba. You really touched me when you spoke about Ambur Jamela, the guy who left this world, I'm sure more than 15, 20 years ago. And to be honest with you, he was an up-and-coming businessman. He would have been far above you by now. And may his soul rest in peace. To Mr. Tony Leon, I heard you saying at some stage your mom once told you that you were clever. And you are one of the most respected intellectuals in this country. Former President Thabo Mbeki is one of them. Would you have taken this ambassadorial job if, for argument's sake, Thabo Mbeki offered you one? And at some stage, I understand when you took the position, there were a lot of rumblings within your party. Some saying you should not have taken it. Some saying you were right to take it. Your comments, sir, please.
Okay, second question.
Thank you, sir. Ntombokelo Hongo is how I'm known. My question to you, Mr. Leon, is my interest is on the title itself. The accidental ambassador. And I kept on thinking is this title, was it because you didn't want to go to be an ambassador, or was it a question of what the guy has raised here that you wanted to cling on the politics, or was it a question of the fact that you managed to go there and you still managed to crack through to get to the economic development and trade of the country? What was going on when you were giving us the title of the book?
Thank you. There's a gentleman over here.
Good evening. I've got two questions, one for Mr. Mashaba. Back in 2010, you were interviewed by Fin24.com. You were quoted there saying, lack integrity, discipline is what it takes to succeed. Now, as an entrepreneur to today who's aspiring to succeed, if you were to paraphrase what would you say, more especially to those who are lacking the first attribute, which is luck? To Mr. Leon, you touched one of the, I think, the key successes of a country like South Africa, which is tourism. In this regard, I will share my belief, and I would like you to comment on it. I believe that one of the key successes of tourism are based on the successful transport mechanisms of the country, because transport is what brings about access to tourism, you see, of the country. Now, what is your take on that?
Sure. Should I go first?
Yes.
Okay. I think we will stop the questions now because they're getting very difficult. Well, let me start with the third question. Tourism, absolutely key driver. It's the easiest thing to promote if you have a good product, and South Africa has many good tourism products. Let me start with the sort of meta-transport issue. Obviously, air links are hugely important. It wasn't just, we were a good embassy, or we had the World Cup. It also helped that there are 3 direct weekly return flights between Buenos Aires and Johannesburg, and there are 14 between Sao Paulo next door and Johannesburg. So we're on direct air links, 2 air portals in South America next door to each other, coming to South Africa. So that helps enormously. It's much easier. You just look at the tourism figures, it's a chicken and the egg. The more integrated your air links are, the easier it is to get people here, and it's more attractive to come. Within the country, obviously, big factor as well. And, there's not just the air links within a country, the ground, transportation, all those things play a key role. But I need to also say that if you have a unique tourism product, people come. I mean, the most extraordinary place I think I've ever visited in my life is the Galapagos Islands, which is unbelievable. It's like in the footsteps of Charles Darwin, which is 1,000 miles off the coast of Ecuador, and it is not easy to get for. I mean, it's well organized, but you've got to make an effort to go there. You'll see the most amazing natural wonders in the world. So having a good transport infrastructure and route system is important, but you've got to have the product. Perhaps the counterexample, of course, is Dubai. I mean, who'd ever heard of Dubai? They went and created an international global hub in the middle of a desert. And people now are going to use those airlines from the United Arab Emirates probably more than any other airline going forward. And that was a deliberate economic decision which brought people to a place, albeit they're going to stay for a few hours and then change planes to another place, which they would never otherwise would have gone to. So I think the answer, broadly speaking, is yes, with 1 or 2 qualifications. Okay, why the title The Accidental Ambassador? Well, it is revealed inside the book, But the short answer, not perhaps just to give you a summary, I never set out, there are people quite commendably who spend their whole lives intending to become ambassadors or heads of mission. It certainly wasn't in my job description or in my planning schedule. And even my first meeting with President Zuma, who actually offered me another position in South Africa, which I declined, and this then led on to the ambassadorship, was accidental. So I don't think he had in mind initially me being a diplomat. It's what arose from a conversation which I describe in the first chapter of this book. But that, of course, leads me to the first question. I was asked about some grumblings inside and doubtless outside my party as well. I do record them here as well, about someone like me who'd been the leader of the opposition all those years becoming an ambassador of the country, or the government, I suppose, that I'd opposed. I did say in my introductory remarks that I think President Zuma is correct, or at least it was correct at the time, because I was the fourth of a quartet of DA former MPs who went into the world as ambassadors, and that he wanted people other than just ANC people to represent South Africa. If you're going to have politicians as ambassadors, they should come from all sides of the political fence. And I think that is correct, although inside my party, I'm sure there were people who thought, this is not what you should be doing, but I'd been an MP for 20 years, I'd led the DA and the DP for 13 years, and I decided to retire and to go in my own time, because the thing about political leadership is to jump before you get pushed, you see, so I jumped before I could get pushed. And it happens to everyone, let me tell you, unless you do what I did, you get prized out of there. In fact, at the beginning of my book, there's an acquaintance of mine who happens to be the mayor of London. There's a lot of speculation that he's going to become the next Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson. I'll tell you what he said. He said, "It is a necessary fact of political biology that we never know when our time is up. Long after it is obvious that we are goners, we continue to believe it is our duty to hang on with cuticle-wrenching intensity to the privileges of our post. We kid ourselves that we must stay because we'd be letting people down and there is a job to be finished. In reality, we are just terrified of the come down. All politicians are masters of procrastination, but there is no day they find easier to postpone than the day of their own resignation." Well, I decided to resign from Parliament and from the leadership 2 years before I left Parliament. So I was out in the world and this position came up, and I decided to embrace it, to put into practice what I'd previously preached about, that we should have a wall between the party and the state. And frankly, I completely accept that there are differences of opinion about that. And that's fine. That's what a democracy is about, and that's what a democratic discussion is. And if people disagree with me, this book is not an apologia. It's not a sort of saying, I did this, but here's how great and I was and all. It's not that at all. I actually interrogate exactly the questions 1 and 2 about, was it being a sellout to go and be the ambassador of the country? Could you do it? Could you keep your principles intact and still do that representative job? And I look at that fully and I hope fairly. And of course, if people disagree with that, that's their good right to do so.
You've done that, even Beggy asked you to? That's what he asked?
Well, I had the one very nice meeting I had with Taba and Becky, sorry, I didn't hear that part of the question, was we had a very warm meeting. Admittedly, there were no warm meetings while he was president, I was leader of the opposition. There were plenty, incidentally, when Taba was the deputy president. We got on extremely well, and at the multi-party negotiations, something happened at the moment he became president and I became the leader of the opposition in June 1999. Now, I was one half of that duo, so let me take part of that responsibility. Although I think the president sets the tone, not the leader of the opposition. But anyway. But when I retired, he very graciously invited me to come and meet with him at the Union Buildings. So I retired as a leader of the party in May 2007, May 2007. And, he said to me, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't know, I'm going to stay in Parliament. I've been given this position at Harvard University, which I was going off to do later that year, and I was going to Cato Institute the next year, and I said, I'll see. So he said, well, if you would like me to do anything, please let me know. Well, it was very gracious of him, but I, didn't arise. But after 2009, because, you know, the country had changed, the president had changed, and we seemed to have a bit of a warming up across the political divide, and President Zuma and I had this meeting, that seemed the right time. It was right for me personally. Whether it was right for the country, I don't know.
Mr. Mashaba?
This gentleman over there requested me to comment on Mr. Jamila Ambur. Really very unfortunate situation. And actually, I look back at the life of Andile. It's really one of those that over the years as business colleagues, we became very close friends. And the New South Africa came. Andile obviously lost his distribution business because he just really could not really deal with the new challenges. We have a new legislative framework where people were stealing from him, we couldn't get rid of them. People started to obviously armed robberies and so forth. Then unfortunately for us as suppliers, we've got to really take a hard view, and that's something really quite unfortunate because not just really Jamel. I remember back in the mid-90s, making a statement, I think it's there in public domain, that I decided at the time to say, look, unfortunately, black distributors in the townships, I can't give them my stock on credit any longer. I mean, really such an unfortunate decision. These are the people who helped me to really build my business because I went all over the country to build those guys up. But then the New South Africa came with crime in our communities. You deliver stock to Jamela, a guy in Soweto, the very same evening he gets the stock, it's gone. And unfortunately he's unable to pay me. And because I'm not a naive businessman, just really operate as if I'm a politician where I've got deep pockets. So obviously I take a business decision to say, look, these guys are unfortunately high risk. So therefore I cannot supply them any longer. And I think it wasn't really a question of really taking a political decision. I was taking a business decision, and Jamel and Dile really fell victim to this, that I just could not really supply him for as long as he owed me money. Unfortunately, Jamel owed me a lot of money, which I could not sue him for. I mean, because I understood this situation, but the only way I could obviously protect my sustainability was to not keep supplying him, and eventually went out of business, went back into the Shabin business, and one day got shot. And remember, came down to East London to the funeral, and I actually spoke at that funeral and made a commitment to the wife and the kids that anything they want, they must come back to me. And it's a decision that my wife keeps reminding me about because literally on a monthly basis, the family comes back to me. They remind me about that issue. I was in Europe two weeks ago. My wife shows me an SMS from Andile's wife. He says, Herman, look at your problem. You created a big problem for me. Because he says, don't go around making promises because at the end of the day, I'm the one who must obviously fulfill that. So it's really quite unfortunate, but it's a really lovely, special friend, someone who really contributed to my success as a business. And how he died, as you rightfully said, his soul let rest in peace. But he was a great human being, great South African, and a personal friend of mine. So I think that's really the little I can say. And it really taught me to really know and appreciate that black people can play rugby and cricket. And regarding the issue, regarding luck, integrity, and stability, I think something that I've shared so many times, even including in my book, that really one decision that I actually treasure in my life was the decision at the age of 22 to get married. Because I was born and brought up in a very troubled society with no parental supervision any longer. I lost my father at the age of 2. My mother was a domestic worker in Johannesburg, earning what you could not even really afford to really, from a transport point of view, to come and out to really see us. So I grew up literally really pure luck. I don't know how one survived because I had no parental supervision. And my siblings, my sisters, at the time when I started seeing what was happening around me, were all obviously at school, and unfortunately the entire community was really going through a difficult time. But then when I felt the need for me to really go into business, for whatever reason, with no business experience, other than really gambling in the township, playing dice, I felt the need for me to really get stability in my life. And the only way I could get it was to get married. And I proposed at the age of 22, and my wife was 20, or my girlfriend at the time was 20. And it's actually one decision that I look back at my life and look at the role my wife played in my life has been quite remarkable. It's something that I so treasure. Because here we are, 31 years later, we're still married and we're the biggest of friends. And obviously, I think a question of integrity, the reason why I believe I keep bouncing back in whatever situation is because of the way I try and really conduct my life as a human being, to really have that integrity, because I like a situation where I can always go back to people. And that's, for me, it's really something that I live by, and something that I also treasure. And if I look at business people and people I've interacted with generally, I'm really quite confident that 98% minimum of those people, at any point in time, I can really go back to them. And the reason why I can go back to them, because I don't really live on the basis of burning bridges. I take hard decisions, and if I have to really take it upfront, I'd rather take that than actually mislead people. I'm not the one to can come out to really misrepresent myself, and that's really what I try and do. So for me, that's really part of really building your integrity, and that's something that I hope that I will manage to live by for the balance of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mashaba.